Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capital Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We're coming to you just a few blocks from Florida's capital. And on behalf of Florida's internet and television providers across the state of Florida, we're bringing you Jim Saunders with the News Service of Florida. Jim, welcome.
Thanks.
All right, so we are here in what week is this? Are we in the fifth week, the fourth week? It's blurring together, Jim.
I don't know. This is the short week. That's
right,
all that really
right. That's
matters.
right. The short
with
week.
The Passover and Good Friday holidays, we get a little bit of a break this week.
Right.
So.
I've noticed a huge smile on your face this morning because it's a short week. I assume the legislature will be feeling similar. Yes? No?
Hard to tell.
Okay. All right. So in this short week, there's going to be a huge issue, probably the largest issue of the session considered, and that's the budget. Where does that stand? Where's the House? Where's the Senate? Where's the governor?
Well, the House and the Senate are going to come in on Wednesday and Thursday of this week. That's it. And they're going to pass out their versions of the budget. They are very far apart at this point. By some numbers, the way you count it, it could be $4 billion apart. Also, there's another way to count it that says $2 billion apart, but regardless, it's big differences.
We're talking billions of
We're
dollars
talking billions,
apart.
so 2, 4, what's the difference at this point?
Okay.
But I think more importantly is that there are differences throughout the budget. I mean, from top to bottom in different areas: education, healthcare, economic development, the tax cut issues. There's differences. So, and member projects, which are a high-profile issue. I mean, there are differences throughout these budgets. And they will pass them out on the House and Senate floors this week. And then the challenge over the next 3 weeks, which are the final 3 scheduled weeks of the session, are to reach an agreement on a final plan. So I think there's a lot of people who still think that it's going to be heading to a special session. But we'll have a little bit better feel for things after this week, after the House and Senate take this sort of initial step of passing their own budgets.
Well, let's dive into a few of the subsections, right? So education is one, certainly that's been on center stage. Talk to us a little bit about what's different in the House and the Senate on education. What are we looking at?
One of the big differences is that Senate President Joe Negron has made a huge priority of higher education, specifically university programs, increasing spending on those programs. He wants, for instance, Bright Future scholarships to be more generous to the top scholars in the Bright Futures program. And the House has not gone along with a lot of that. Also, they are questioning some financing arrangements between university foundations and universities. So that's one area that's really going to be, I think, one of those final issues that's going to get worked out. There's also differences on K-12 funding. There's programmatic differences, but also one of the big differences is on a tax-related issue of money that goes into the school funding formula, the way whether to allow increased home values to provide more money for that formula. The Senate wants to allow that. The House says that's a tax increase. We're not going to allow it. But I mean, we're talking there's $400 million at issue in that issue. So that's an example of the types of things that they're going to have to work out. Speaker Corcoran, Richard Corcoran's kind of dug his heels in on that issue. So, when you're talking $400 million, that's a big number you got to figure out how to make up.
Well, as both sides really start to dig their heels in on their various issues, let's go to another aspect of the budget. Healthcare, hospitals, there's difference in funding there. What's that?
Yeah, there's both the House and Senate budgets would make cuts in Medicaid funding for hospitals. The House proposal is about $400 million deeper in cuts, though, so that's a big difference. They're going to have to work out. The safety net hospitals, particularly those public hospitals, teaching hospitals, are very concerned about this issue because they serve a lot of the Medicaid patients, and if you cut reimbursement rates, it goes straight to their bottom line. They're also, both sides are waiting, and the governor are waiting for word from the federal government about whether $600 million in low-income pool funding will be made available from the federal government. This has been a big issue over the past few years, and it's sort of it's uncertain at this point whether, and the Senate has built that into its budget. The House has not. So again, those are some of the issues. There's also an issue that has emerged recently in the last week or so on nursing home funding, a funding formula that goes in for nursing home Medicaid payments that is pitting not only the House against the Senate, but it's pitting parts of the nursing home industry against each other. So there's a lot of these sorts of issues out there that may not, you look at the big numbers, don't necessarily, you have to look a little bit deeper to figure out what some of these issues really are. Right. That could be, points of contention during these coming weeks.
So on a semi-brighter side, at least if you're in Enterprise Florida's shoes, there was what appeared to be, or Visit Florida, a little bit of easing on position last week. How do you see that falling out on the economic development playground in the budget this week? Well,
I think Visit Florida, the issue in the end is going to be what the number they arrive at and what strings they're going to put on Visit Florida. The House is around $25 million for Visit Florida, and I believe the Senate's around 76. And the governor also wants that higher number. The speaker has made a big deal out of what he considers wasteful spending at Visit Florida. And the House, again, as you alluded to, originally talked about abolishing it. But the Senate and governor made clear they didn't want to abolish Visit Florida. So now I think it's going to be a matter of where can they meet in the middle on a number. I don't think it's going to be as high as the Senate and the governor want, but it may not be as low as what the speaker wants. Right. But I also think that the speaker has laid out some conditions, if you will, for Visit Florida to operate under, in which to tighten up their operations. So I think those are going to be some of the things that are going to have to be negotiated. Enterprise Florida, still is at zero in the House budget. The House has voted to abolish Enterprise Florida. I have a hard time thinking that, it's going to be interesting to see, but I have a hard time believing that Speaker Corcoran's going to move off that position very easily. But we have the governor out, as we have talked about in the past. I mean, he's out running TV ads, essentially calling out the House Speaker and House members for their opposition to Enterprise Florida, and says it's imperative to have these programs for job creation. He was out again last week. The governor was in members' districts calling them out by name for opposing these sorts of programs. So that kind of has an impact at some point. But the speaker has been very, very assertive that he does not want to fund Enterprise Florida. He wants to abolish it. He calls it corporate welfare, what these economic incentive programs.
So you look at that relationship that's happening between the governor and the speaker, and then yet you have Senate President Negron saying that we're not that far apart in relation to where they've been in previous years. So will President Negron be the peacemaker? Is he giving false hope to those folks that want to cancel their lease and get out of town? Is there any hope for it ending on time?
There is truth in what he says. Okay. I mean, there's always differences between the House and the Senate. I mean, that's just the way it is. There are, and there's always posturing that goes on ahead of time before they go into negotiations. I mean, it happens every year, as he alluded to. I do think some of the differences this year, though, are more sharp than they have been in the past. Part of that is, I do think, is because the speaker and the governor have been so contentious going into this process. But it is possible they could work these things out. But it's not an election year. They don't have to get out of here as quickly as they might during an election year.
Right.
As I said, I think most people are still believing that there may be a special session on the horizon. I do think, to your point, the Senate has been kind of more laid back about these issues than the House has. So, they can sit back in the weeds, especially on this economic development. So, I mean, Jack Latval, the appropriations chairman, was quoted this weekend, and he was at an appearance down in Citrus County, I believe, saying, the speaker is off track. He's not right on these economic development issues. So they've done things like that, but they haven't really fully engaged in this war of words between the speaker and the governor. So I think that's kind of put them in a position where they can maybe have a little bit more flexibility going forward.
Right. Okay. So let's look at one last issue, at least that potentially can see some change this week, or some passage, if we will, or movement. Workers' comp. What's happening in workers' comp? I mean, it's literally been spread out, diced out, put back together. It's the bionic man at this point.
Well, we probably won't see much action this week because it is a short week. But the House Commerce Committee last week approved a totally revised workers' comp bill that made the business community happy. The business community have been very unhappy about earlier versions, both in the House and the Senate. The main issue, no matter how you slice it, is attorney's fees. People talk about worker benefits and so on, but the real point of contention on these bills is attorney's fees for attorneys who sue on behalf of injured workers. And both initial House and Senate bills had talked about maximum of $250 an hour, which the business community said was a non-starter to them because they're afraid that's going to raise rates. The House brought in a totally revised, or not totally, but a very revised bill last week that would cut that down to $150 an hour. And there's all sorts of a process that judges would have to go through to set attorneys' fees. The business community seems happy. The trial bar and the labor unions, particularly, are not happy with this House version. Right. Meanwhile, the Senate has a different bill that still has $250 in it. So there's going to have to be some middle ground found on that issue, or maybe the Senate will move towards where the House is. Right. I don't know.
Or the House still has plenty of votes that seem they could be friendly to the trial bar and the unions, and strike-alls are the bane of everybody's existence.
Well, and
we're moving into strike-all time.
We're moving into strike-all time, and they made these changes last week in a series of amendments, but there's going to be a lot of behind-the-scenes talking on this issue. Yeah. I mean, the business community doesn't want to go home without something a workers' comp bill passed.
Nor do the trial lawyers.
Well, the rates went up 14.5%. They started in December. Right. So, and part of that was, a large part of it was the Supreme Court striking down limits on attorneys' fees. So I think the business community needs something more than the trial bar does. The unions are squawking because they say that there's just not enough being done for worker benefits. Right. That worker benefits were cut. In 2003, there was a big workers' comp revamp. And, the unions have been unhappy with that ever since 2003. And they're saying, this isn't just an attorney's fee issue. There's issues related to worker benefits. So it's a very difficult issue. I mean, two, you get healthcare providers involved if you start whacking what they get paid. Right. So it's a very difficult issue that I think we're going to have to watch very closely over these next few weeks to see what emerges in the end.
All right. So let's move out of the legislative process for a second. We've got the once every 2 decades, 20 years, the Constitutional Revision Commission. It's met again, and where does that stand? Any significant topics coming out of that?
Yeah, the commission met twice last week down in South Florida, and they meet up here in Tallahassee on Wednesday. Part of the things that they're hearing are issues like abortion rights. There's a privacy clause in the Constitution that there's been a lot of speculation that the commission could propose a change to that privacy clause, which would make it easier to pass laws restricting abortions. So they have heard a lot about that. They've heard about voting rights, felon voting rights. So there's those sorts of issues I think they're getting a lot of play. I think a lot of those issues are coming from Democrats and people on the left, and this commission is pretty conservative, its makeup. So
are we seeing like early discussions on those items, and then the big footballs will come in later?
Well,
is that what you're
I tend to think that there's a lot of people showing up at these public hearings and venting on some of these issues. I'm not sure that's where this commission's going to end up in the end. But it's too early to really know because they are just taking public input at this point. Right. And this is really a year-long process to determine what questions to put on the ballot. But clearly there are groups that are mobilizing, trying to influence this commission. And I think it'll be interesting to see on Wednesday in Tallahassee. It's going to be at Florida A&M University. Tallahassee is full of interest groups, and you know, so there's I think there could be a turnout there, but again, this input may not reflect what turns out in the end. I think.
Okay. All right. So let's take it back from the state of Florida, the traveling CRC, coming back to Tallahassee, and let's go back into the Capitol. Next week is when the pace picks up, and we're a couple of weeks out from the end of session. So as that speed picks up, what are we looking at next week, the week after, and then the final week?
Well, you know, one of the things that's come up is that they're going to try to negotiate a gambling deal. Both sides have passed bills, and frankly, they're far apart too. But I think they all want to get one done because they're Seminole. They want to reach a deal with the Seminole tribe and get some money out of it. You know, there's a couple issues we've talked about in the past that look like they have a pretty good chance. One of which is the whole ride-sharing the Uber bill. Everybody calls it the Uber bill. But you know, that has passed the House, and it's flying through the Senate for the first time. I think they're on the way to passing that, and I wouldn't be surprised if that passed relatively early, comparatively, not a last minute thing. You know, one other thing.
Now wait, let's stay on Uber for a second. If that passes in what you're seeing today, are they doing backflips and celebrating, or is it a happy medium between the cabs and the Uber folks?
Well, I think the Uber people would see this as a clear victory. I mean, they've been wanting statewide regulation as opposed to having to deal with all these local government agency regulations. And so this is what they've been wanting for a few years. Some of the details might not be exactly what they have, you know, in their ideal world, but they've wanted this sort of statewide regulatory regimen. So, you know, the local governments too are not happy with that because they like control, local control over you know, who's doing business there. So. I think that is one, though, that it definitely looks like it's on the move. They've still got to work out some differences on Stand Your Ground, the Stand Your Ground bill, which you know, has passed both chambers, but they've still got to. That involves a burden of proof in Stand Your Ground cases. Very high-profile, controversial bill. The House and the Senate have passed different versions of the bill. I tend to think in the end they will come to a conclusion on it because there's some legal issues they have to work out. So that's another one that you know, we're going to be seeing over the next couple of weeks. Another issue that's a budget issue, but it's also a policy issue, is President Negron's push for a big water project down south of Lake Okeechobee. He kind of backed off a little bit on it last week, or didn't back off. He scaled it back a little bit. The dollar numbers he scaled back, the amount of land, where the land would be, that sort of thing. But he still faces a lot of pushback on that issue. From the sugar industry, other farmers down there, some of the local communities, and the House has been really non-committal about that issue, and the governor hasn't said much either. So he's, you know, he's trying to somehow work a deal on that, I think. So that's another one I think we're really going to have to watch.
Water, gaming, citizens' protections with firearms, all of these issues, precursors to the very last week of session. Some might hold over to the end, so we'll stay tuned.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual, though, for big issues to be pushed back to the end and then passed in a flurry of deals and bills flying. I mean, that's just the way it's always worked as long as I've been here.
Well, as this short week is upon all of us in the game, Jim, I look forward to reading your updates this week, because even though it's a short week, it's a week, and folks are still moving around in the Senate and the House and the executive branch. So
That's true.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
That's all the time we have for today's Capitol Dateline Online. Thanks for tuning in. If you can, hit us up on our Facebook page and follow us at Capitol Dateline Online, and follow us on Twitter at the FCTA. Thanks again.